In the first half of this biology course, we spent a lot of time talking about just different topics that we're going to apply to all life. We talked about cell structure, which every living thing is made up of cells. So we talked a lot about cell structure and how cells reproduce and the genetics that are involved there. We talked about how cells even came to be. Was it creation by a loving God, or was it evolution? We talked about the chemistry of life. We talked about a variety of different things, and all of the topics that we've talked about so far really apply to all life forms. But now in the second half of the course, we're going to be looking at organisms in specific categories that are very similar to each other, talking about their characteristics. And so that's what you can expect for the second half of the year now. As we start this chapter, which, it's titled Prokaryotes and Viruses, but we're starting out the chapter with a classification system that, as you learned in your reading and in the video that you watched yesterday, was started by a scientist named Linnaeus. And since he came up with his system, we have since added to that. There's been some disagreement as to exactly how organisms should be classified. He didn't know anything about microorganisms, so obviously those had to be added into the picture. So the first thing, again, that we're looking at is the classification system that we're going to use. And the order of a certain number of taxons that we put organisms into to determine how we're going to classify them based on their characteristics. Now, depending on the book that you use, sometimes this is going to change. In fact, when I started teaching biology, the very first taxon that we are going to be using, the domain, that wasn't even a thing then. We always started with kingdom. And so now we actually have 8 taxons that that gradually get smaller and smaller, that we put these organisms in. And so you need to make sure that you have these taxons organized, memorized in order of how they are actually going to come. So the biggest one is the domain, then kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. And like I said, it's going to depend on exactly what book you use and what viewpoint that particular author has. Your author starts with a domain, and so I want you to include that as you are memorizing this list. Sometimes using a mnemonic to help you remember that can be helpful. She gives you one mnemonic, but she doesn't start with the domain. She starts with kingdom, and I want to make sure that you have that domain at the top of the list. The mnemonic that I like to use is this one. Dumbfounded, King Philip cried, "Oh, for goodness sake." And as you can see, if you use this particular mnemonic, the beginning letter of each letter in this sentence is going to correspond to the beginning letter of each of the taxons. So dumbfounded, King Philip cried, "Oh, for goodness sake." And that will help you remember domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. So what we want to do first is we want to look at just some overall characteristics of some of the larger taxons here. As you go further and further down, what you need to be aware of is that the organisms are going to be more and more like each other. If you're way up here, the organisms may be grouped together for a particular reason, but they may not look very much alike until you start going down here and you get down on the family and the genus levels especially, and then the species are going to be very much alike. So the table that I provided for you, I found that one of the diagrams she had in the book I thought was a little bit confusing, so I wanted to make sure that you were understanding the difference between the domains and the kingdoms. Like I said a few minutes ago, the kingdom is actually, when I learned biology back eons and eons ago, the kingdom was the highest level, and at that point there were 5 kingdoms, and the 5 kingdoms were Monierans, Protistans, fungi, plantae, and Animalia. When Linnaeus started his classification system, he only had plantae and Animalia because that's all he knew about. He didn't know about microorganisms, and he took fungi and stuck them in with the plants because they kind of look like plants, really, so that's where he had put them. And then the more that we got to know about some of these different organisms, they were separated and eventually were separated into 5 kingdoms. Now, the more studying we got to do about Kingdom Monera, we found out that they really were a lot more different than we initially had recognized. And so they put in a level up above that and said there's actually 2 different domains in which all Moneras fit. So this is actually kind of backwards from what we normally think of as far as just being, as you go down, you get more and more similar, whereas this one, if you go, in this one particular instance, you go up and you're going to make them more similar to each other. So these 4 kingdoms are all in domain Eukarya, whereas Monerans actually are classified into 2 different domains, Archaea and Bacteria. So what we want to do is we want to look at 4 specific types of characteristics for these kingdoms. And again, this is something that you're going to need to be able to have at the tip of your fingertips as we go through this material. The types of questions that you're asked on your homework today will also be very similar to some of the types of questions that you're going to be asking on your test, and they're going to require that you understand the information in this table. So let's go through this and make sure that you understand the difference between these kingdoms. Let's start with cell type. The cell type, you know that there are 2 types. There are prokaryotic cells and there are eukaryotic cells. And you should remember that eukaryotic cells are the ones that have membrane-bound organelles, things like a nucleus and Golgi bodies and vacuoles and chloroplasts and all sorts of fun stuff like that. Whereas prokaryotic cells do not have any specific membrane-bound organelles. Now, they will still have ribosomes because ribosomes are required for protein production, but ribosomes do not have a membrane around them, so they're not a membrane-bound organelle. Also, the genetic material in a prokaryotic cell is just kind of floating around all over the place. It's not enclosed within the nucleus. So we've got prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. And so in Kingdom Monera, all of these, in fact, I really should have had another line coming down here because we're going to separate these 2. This is going to be domain Archaea and domain Bacteria are both going to be prokaryotic cells. Again, no membrane-bound organelles in these organisms. And all the rest of them going across are going to be eukaryotic cells. They're all going to have membrane-bound organelles. So eukaryotic, eukaryotic, eukaryotic here, and also for Kingdom Animalia. Okay, so, and again, this is the characteristic that before these 2 domains were introduced, basically you said if an organism has a prokaryotic cell, it's going to be in Kingdom Monera. So if you were using only the 5 kingdom system, that is the definition that you would use for that. How many cells are each one of these made up of here? Well, in Kingdom Archaea, they only are 1-celled organisms. There's never anything any larger than that. In Kingdom Bacteria, it's either going to be a single cell or what we classify as a simple association of cells. What's a simple association of cells? Well, that just means that the cells have found that living together provides them benefits. So it may provide an ability to get food better. It may provide protection from predators. And so they tend to live together as a group, but they are still very much still 1-cell organisms. They don't specialize in any way. Each cell still performs all the different functions of life, but they are just living together as a group. Kingdom Protista is going to be the same way. It's going to be a lot of single-celled organisms, or there may be a simple association of cells living together. But again, each individual organism is only one cell, and it must perform all of the functions of life in order to survive. Now, once you get into kingdom fungi, most of those, not all, but most of those are multicellular. There are a few that are not, and when we talk about fungi a little bit later on, we will talk about one very familiar form of a fungus to you that is definitely just has one cell, but most of them are multicellular. And then when you get down to Plantae and Animalia, they are all going to be multicellular. And once you become multicellular, that is when the cells start to take on specific tasks. They become specialized, and so they may have one particular function that they carry out, whereas some of the other cells in that organism don't carry out those same functions. Okay? All right, so number of cells. Feeding. Now remember when we talked about how different organisms feed, we said some of them are autotrophic, which means they are going to make their own food. Some of them are heterotrophic, which means that they have to get their food from someplace else. Now, when you get into both archaea and bacteria, what we find is that I'm just going to put auto for autotrophic and hetero for heterotrophic. I'm not going to write the whole word out just to save a little bit of time during the video here. But we will find that archaea and bacteria are both autotrophic and heterotrophic. Now, I don't mean that the same organism is both autotrophic and heterotrophic. What I mean is that there are some autotrophs in this domain, and there are some heterotrophs in this domain. Same thing for domain bacteria. Protista are the same way. Some of them are autotrophic, and some of them are heterotrophic. We're going to find some of both. Some that can make their own food, some that have to take in other food to get the energy that they need. Kingdom fungi, they're heterotrophic, but within the category of being heterotrophic, they are mostly decomposers. There are a few exceptions, but mostly they are decomposers. So what that means is that they're saprophytic, you may have seen that word, and they're going to feed mostly on dead material. Okay, so I'll put heterotrophic up here, but they are mostly decomposers within the category of being heterotrophic. Kingdom Plantae is going to be mostly autotrophic, and you're maybe going, how do we have a plant that doesn't make its own food? I thought that's what the characteristic of a plant does. Well, again, they're mostly autotrophic, but if you have a plant like a Venus flytrap, you know that they capture insects, and while they don't actually use that as food, they still utilize some of the materials that they get from the insects that they capture in producing the nutrients and the food that they need for that. So again, mostly autotrophic. You may find a couple of exceptions there. And then in Kingdom Animalia, they're all going to be heterotrophic, but there are no decomposers within this kingdom. Okay, so heterotrophic, but no decomposers. All right, then finally, what environment do we find them in? Now, all of these are going to be the same except for Kingdom Archaea, and what we find here is that these guys live in very, very extreme environments, and we're going to get more into that just a little bit later in this chapter. So they live in very extreme environments, like they're going to live in places like down in the bottom of the ocean where there's hot steam vents coming, volcanic lava, places where it's really, really hot, places where it's really, really cold, you know, very far below zero, those kinds of temperatures. These kinds of organisms thrive in those kinds of environments, whereas every single other organism that we know about does not thrive in extreme environments. In fact, they're going to die if they get into extreme environment. So all the rest of these are going to be not extreme. So we'll just fill in not extreme in all the rest of these boxes here for the sake of having our table full. And finally, not extreme over here. Okay, so now you can see the various categories here that we've got filled in. Prokaryotic cells only in kingdom Monera, eukaryotic cells for everything else. The first three, Monerans and Protistans, are one-cell organisms, where most of the organisms in the others are going to be multicellular. Autotrophics and heterotrophics are going to be mixed in the first three, whereas once you get up to the fungi, plantae, and animalia, they're more separated. And then only kingdom Archaea are going to live in extreme environments, while everything else does not live in an extreme environment. So again, make sure that you know this table well, that you understand the differences between the different kinds of domains and the different kinds of kingdoms, so that you can easily classify an organism into which one of those kingdoms that it's going to fit into.